The most dangerous man in England, the one feared by the entire underworld, sits silently each morning in a small cafe by the lake, just to watch a 9-year-old child. No one knows why. Not even he. But when violence from the past resurfaces, when fire tears through that quiet street, the truth of the young mother has buried for 9 years will erupt uncontrollably. That man is no stranger. He is the child's father, and he has just brought hell with him. If you enjoy stories of secrets, danger, and love that never truly dies, hit like now and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has progressed. Don't miss a second. The fog came off the lake every morning the same way. Slow, deliberate, like something that had no intention of leaving. It settled over the water first, then crept across the gravel path that ran along the shoreline, then pushed up against the cafe windows until the glass sweated with cold. Mara Whitmore had lived with that fog for 4 years. She knew its rhythms better than she knew most people. She was already behind the counter at 5:45, the espresso machine cycling through its warm-up hiss, when she heard Elliot's feet on the stairs above the kitchen. Not running. He never ran in the morning. He came down slow, deliberate, one hand trailing the wall because he always woke up half blind until he'd had his glass of orange juice. She heard the creak of the third step, the one she kept meaning to fix. And then his shadow appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and the cafe floor. "Morning," he said. His voice was still rough with sleep. "Juice is on the counter," she said without turning around. He patted across the tile in his socks. 9 years old, already too tall for his age, with dark hair that refused to lie flat no matter what she did to it. He had her jawline, sharp, a little stubborn, but there were things about his face she couldn't account for. The way his brows pulled together when he was thinking, the stillness in him when he was angry instead of the explosion she'd have at his age. She didn't think about where those things came from. She had made a decision long ago not to think about that, and most days the decision held. He drank his juice standing at the counter, watching the fog press against the windows. "It's thick today," he said. "It's always thick." "Not like this." He set the glass down. "You need help before school? I need you to eat something." "I'm not hungry." "Elliot." He grabbed a piece of the bread she'd already cut and toasted and took a bite without any particular enthusiasm. She watched his profile while she pulled the first milk delivery from the refrigerator. There was a school bus at 7:15 that stopped at the end of the gravel path, and he'd never once missed it, not in 4 years. She didn't know where he'd gotten that reliability, certainly not from her. The cafe opened at 6. The first customer was always Thomas Riddell, 63, retired surveyor, who ordered black coffee and read the same regional newspaper he'd been reading since before Mara arrived in Harwick. He sat at the table nearest the door because he said the cold air helped him think. He barely spoke except to say thank you and occasionally to comment on the weather. Mara liked Thomas Riddell very much. Then came the morning rush, a relative term in a lake town of 1,100 people, which lasted from 6:30 to 8 and involved mostly construction workers from the highway project 40 minutes north, a few teachers, the woman who ran the post office, and a rotating cast of retirees who treated the cafe as an extension of their living rooms. Mara knew all of them. She knew their orders, their family situations, the names of their dogs. She had built that knowledge the same way she'd built everything else in Harwick, carefully, patiently, one small piece at a time. She had come here with nothing. A duffel bag, $800, and Elliot asleep in the back seat of a car she'd bought with cash from a woman in a parking lot outside Columbus. She didn't have a plan exactly. She had a direction, a way, and she had a name she'd found online, a property in a small English lake town that had been sitting empty for 2 years after its previous owner, an elderly widower, had died without heirs. The lease was cheap enough to be almost unbelievable. She'd taken it as a sign and then caught herself and reminded herself that she didn't believe in signs anymore. The cafe had been in poor shape when she arrived. The windows were clouded with grime, the espresso machine was older than she was, and the wooden floor had warped in 3 places from water damage. She'd fixed it herself, mostly. She'd learned carpentry from a YouTube video at 2 in the morning while Elliot slept in the back room. And she'd done the floors badly the first time and had to redo them. And she'd done them badly the second time too, but less badly, and by the third time they were something she wasn't ashamed of. She'd built this. With her hands and her stubbornness and the particular desperate energy of a woman who had run out of other options. And it worked. Not in any spectacular way, not in any way that would make someone want to write about it. But it worked. The money covered the rent and the utilities and Elliot's school fees and the ingredients and some modest leftover at the end of each month that she put into a savings account she never touched. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The stranger first appeared on a Tuesday in late October. She didn't notice him the way she would later reconstruct noticing him. At the time, she registered him the same way she registered anyone who came through the door. A body, a face, an order to be taken. He came in just after the morning rush had died down, around 8:15, when only Thomas Riddell remained at his table by the door, and the cafe had that particular morning quiet that Mara loved. The espresso machine cooling, the light coming gray and watery off the lake, the sound of nothing particular. He was tall. That was the first thing. Not in an ostentatious way, but in a way that made the ceiling feel slightly lower. He wore a dark coat that was too well made for Harwick, and he moved through the doorway without any of the awkward shoulder-first adjustment that most tall people used. He looked around the cafe once, not like someone looking for a familiar face, but like someone assessing a room for things they didn't yet understand. Then he went to the corner table, the one farthest from the door, farthest from the window, with its back to the wall. He pulled out the chair and sat down facing the room. Mara came out from behind the counter with her pad. "What can I get you?" He looked at her. His eyes were dark, and there was something exhausted in them that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation, the kind of tired that lives in the structure of a face rather than under the eyes. "Coffee," he said. The accent was English. London, she thought, the specific flattened vowels of someone who'd grown up south of the river. "Filter or espresso?" "Espresso, double." She wrote it down. "Anything else?" He looked at the menu board above the counter for a moment. "That's all." She made his coffee and brought it to him, and he didn't look at her when she set it down. He was looking at the window, at the fog on the lake. She went back behind the counter. She refilled Thomas Riddell's cup, and they exchanged the usual pleasantries about the temperature, and Thomas went back to his newspaper, and she began cleaning the steamer wand and forgot about the man in the corner. He was gone when she looked up 20 minutes later. He'd left exact change on the table, which nobody in Harwick ever did. They always asked for the total and handed over a note and waited for change. This man had known the price of a double espresso before he'd been told it. She thought about that for about 4 seconds and then stopped thinking about it. He came back the next morning. Same time, same table, same order. She brought him his coffee, and he gave her exact change before she'd told him the total, and she almost said something but didn't. He looked at the window the whole time. He was gone before 9. On the third morning, Elliot missed the school bus. It was her fault, she knew that. She'd been distracted by a delivery dispute with the dairy supplier, and she'd lost track of time. And by the time she surfaced from the phone call, it was 7:20, and Elliot was still at the kitchen table with his homework spread out in front of him, not because he was doing homework, but because he was a 9-year-old who had no particular internal clock for things that didn't interest him. "You missed the bus," she said. He looked up, genuinely unconcerned. "I know." "Elliot, you were on the phone. You know when the bus leaves. You know when the bus leaves, too." He said it without any heat, which somehow made it worse. Just a fact. Just a quiet assessment of shared responsibility. She drove him to school in the old Land Rover that she'd bought from a farmer outside town, which made a sound like something dying whenever she went over 30 miles an hour, and she was back at the cafe by 7:50 with the morning rush still trickling and 3 people waiting. She apologized to all of them. 2 of them waved it off. The third, a retired colonel named Briggs, who had opinions about punctuality, made a noise that was not quite a complaint but was not a complaint either. The stranger was at his corner table. She hadn't seen him come in. He'd arrived during the 7-minute window when she'd been gone and settled himself in his chair and ordered nothing yet. He was watching the door when she came back in, and when she looked at him, he looked away, back to the window. She took 3 orders, made 4 drinks, delivered them, apologized to Briggs again, and then went to the corner table. "Sorry for the wait. What can I get you?" "Same as before." She wrote it down. She was turning to go when he said, without looking at her, "You have a son. She stopped. It wasn't a question. It wasn't anything that required an answer. But the specific flatness of it, the way he said it like someone reporting a fact they'd been sitting with for a while, made her chest go tight in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. Most of my customers do, she said. Have children. He didn't respond to that. She went back behind the counter and made his coffee, and her hands were steady because she had spent years building steady hands, and when she brought it to him, she set it down cleanly and turned and walked away. She thought about it for the rest of the morning and hated herself for thinking about it. It was nothing. He'd made an observation. People made observations. She'd served the man 3 times, and he'd noticed she had a child. That was not a remarkable thing. But that night, lying in bed, listening to Elliot breathe through the monitor she still kept in his room, even though he was 9 and didn't need it, she'd tried to take it away twice, and each time had retrieved it from the box before morning. She turned the sentence over in her mind like a stone she was looking under. You have a son. Not is that your son or cute kid. You have a son. The present tense, the second person. Something almost proprietary in it. She told herself she was being paranoid, which she was, which she had always been, which was not a character flaw but a survival mechanism that she had earned. She did not sleep well. He was there the next morning, and the morning after that. By the second week of November, his presence at the corner table had become as reliable as Thomas Riedell's presence at the table by the door, and the morning regulars had absorbed him the way small-town regulars absorb anything new, with initial wariness and then systematic indifference. He never spoke to anyone else. He never brought a phone out, never opened a laptop. He sat and drank his coffee and watched the window or occasionally watched the cafe floor, and when Elliot happened to be in the cafe, on weekends or the one day a week he got out of school at noon, the man's attention shifted in a way Mara had to actively stop herself from cataloging. She cataloged it anyway. He looked at Elliot the way you look at something you can't quite place, like a word you almost know, like a face that belongs to a different context and you're trying to rebuild the context. There was nothing threatening in it, or nothing that manifested as threatening, but it wasn't nothing either. It was too specific, too sustained. She told herself she would stop serving him. She didn't stop serving him, partly because she was a professional and she ran a business and a customer had the right to sit in her cafe as long as he ordered and paid and didn't cause trouble. And he had never caused trouble. And partly, if she was honest with herself, because she wanted to watch him too. She wanted to understand what she was looking at. She wanted to put a name to the thing that happened in her chest when she heard the door open at 8:15 and knew without looking that it was him. She told herself it was vigilance. She had been vigilant her whole adult life. Vigilance was what kept her and Elliot safe. His name was Adrian Vale. She found it out by accident, the way you find out everything you were trying not to find out. A woman came into the cafe on the 3rd Saturday in November, mid-40s, fine-boned, a coat that probably cost more than Mara's monthly rent. And she stood in the doorway and surveyed the room, and when her eyes landed on the corner table, she crossed to it without ordering and sat down across from the man without being invited. Mara watched from the counter. She couldn't hear what they said. The cafe was half full and the noise covered it. But she watched the woman lean forward with something urgent in her posture, and she watched the man, Adrian, she would find out, listen without expression, and then say something short and final, and the woman sat back as if she'd been pushed. After a moment, she stood up and walked out without having ordered anything and without saying goodbye, and the man who was now Adrian Vale went back to watching the window. The woman had said his name once. Mara had read it off her lips. Adrian. That was all. Just a name. A common enough name. But Mara went into the kitchen and stood at the sink for 3 minutes with the water running cold over her wrists, because that was the thing she did when her heart was doing something she couldn't explain, and she thought, no. She thought, you are building a structure out of nothing. You are doing the thing you always do, which is taking the raw material of coincidence and hammering it into the shape of your fears. She turned the water off. She went back out to the counter. She took 3 orders and made 4 drinks and didn't look at the corner table. He left at 9:15. Exact change on the table. She spent the afternoon after the cafe closed sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop while Elliot did homework across from her, and she searched the name. She didn't search it connected to anything specific, just the name, first and last. She didn't have a last name yet. She found it 6 days later, and she wished she hadn't. It came from something Elliot said, innocuous enough at the time. He'd been telling her about a book he was reading, some thriller one of the older boys at school had lent him, and he'd mentioned a character who had a name that sounded like Vale, rhymed with something, and Mara had said the word without thinking, Vale. And something clicked behind her eyes. Not a memory, exactly. More like the outline of one. The shape of a name she'd heard in a different life, spoken in a different context, in a register that had nothing to do with lakeside cafes or fogged windows or a child doing homework at a kitchen table. She waited until Elliot was asleep. Then she went back to the laptop. Adrian Vale. She typed it with the precision of someone handling something they weren't sure was safe. The results came back wrong. Not wrong in the sense of irrelevant, wrong in the sense of what they were. The first result was a business profile, a holding company, British, registered in London, with subsidiaries across 6 countries, and fingers in logistics, private security, and what was described in one piece of financial journalism as asset reclamation and debt resolution. The language was careful, the kind of careful that meant something. The second result was an article from a London tabloid 4 years old that she almost didn't click on. She clicked on it. The photo loaded slowly because her internet connection was unreliable after 10 at night. It loaded from the top, resolving in strips. The headline first, something about a Westminster corruption inquiry, then the top of a figure, shoulders in a dark suit, then the face. Mara sat in the kitchen of her cafe at 11:40 on a Tuesday night and felt the floor tilt under her feet even though she was sitting down. The face in the photo was the face of the man who sat in her corner table every morning. She had known it before she clicked. That was the honest truth. She had known it the way you know something when you're not yet ready to know it. She had been running the same calculation for 3 weeks and refusing to acknowledge what it kept producing. She closed the laptop. She sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, listening to the fog settle against the windows, listening to Elliot breathe through the monitor. Her hands were on the table and they were not steady. Adrian Vale. The name meant something in certain parts of London that she had spent 9 years trying to forget. It meant controlled violence and enormous wealth and a kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself because it had never needed to. She'd been 19 when she first heard it, 20 when she'd been close enough to the edges of that world to understand what it meant. 21 when she'd run. She had run because she was pregnant. She had run because she was terrified. She had run because the man whose child she was carrying was part of something she wanted no piece of, and because she had not, could not, let that world have any claim on her child. She had never told him. She had told herself 100 versions of why that was the right thing to do, and most of them held up under examination, and some of them didn't, and she had made peace with the ones that didn't because she'd had no choice, and because peace was not the same as certainty, and because Elliot was safe and healthy and growing up in a fog-covered lake town where nobody wanted to hurt him. And now Adrian Vale was sitting in her cafe every morning and looking at her son. The question that stopped her breathing, the question she'd been refusing to sit with for 3 weeks, was not whether he knew. It was, how long has he known? She pushed back from the table. She stood up. Her legs were reliable because she made them reliable. She went to check on Elliot, who was asleep on his back with one arm thrown across his face the way he always slept. And she stood in his doorway for a full minute watching him breathe. And then she went back to the kitchen and sat down again and made herself think. She needed to understand what she was dealing with before she could decide what to do. That was the first principle. The only principle, when everything else dissolved. Understand the situation before you move. Moving blind was how you made things worse. She knew what Adrian Vale was. She knew what kind of men surrounded him and what kind of problems he accumulated and what it meant to be in proximity to all of that. She had been on the periphery of it for 2 years, and she'd walked away with nothing but a heartbeat and a secret, and she had kept that secret because it was the only leverage she had. If he knew about Elliot, if that was why he was here, then the life she had built was already over. She just hadn't accepted it yet. She opened the laptop again. Her hands were steadier now because fear had hardened into something functional. She searched more specifically. She looked for everything she could find about Adrian Vale in the last 6 months. His movements, his business, his public presence. She looked for anything that might tell her what had brought him to Harwick specifically. What she found instead, buried in the third page of results, was a news item from 2 months ago. A bombing, a building in East London, 3 people dead and several more hospitalized. Police described it as an attack connected to organized crime. No arrests. The building had housed one of Adrian Vale's businesses. Someone was already trying to kill him, and he had come to Harwick. He had come to this town, to this cafe, to this corner table, and he was sitting 6 feet from her son every morning. And somewhere behind him, there were people willing to blow up buildings to get to him. Mara closed the laptop. She sat in the cold kitchen and thought about the school bus and the gravel path and the fog on the lake and all the quiet machinery of the life she'd built, and she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that the machinery was already breaking, that it had been breaking since the first morning he'd walked through her door, and that the only question left was whether she could get her son out of the wreckage before it finished coming apart. She heard a sound. Outside. On the gravel path that ran along the lake. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward the cafe. She went very still. The footsteps stopped. She heard nothing for 10 seconds. Then she heard the sound of someone standing at the cafe window, not knocking, not moving. Just standing there in the dark and the fog while she sat frozen in her kitchen with the lights off. Then the footsteps moved again. Away. Back toward the road. Mara let out the breath she'd been holding. She sat until she heard a car door close in the distance and an engine start and pull away. And then she sat for 10 minutes more in the dark kitchen, not moving, not thinking, just listening to the fog settle and Elliot breathe and the lake below do whatever lakes do at midnight when nobody is watching. Then she made a decision. Tomorrow morning, when he walked through the door, she was going to look him in the eye and she was going to know. One way or another, she was going to know if he understood what she had done and why she had done it and what it meant. And if he did know, she was going to do whatever it took to keep Elliot out of the blast radius. She'd been running for 9 years. She was very, very tired of running. But if she had to run again, she would. She had done it before with less, and she could do it again. She had built this life from nothing once. She could build another one. She would build another one. She would do it in the dark and without help and without looking back, because that was what she did. That was the particular terrible skill she had developed in the years since she'd been young and stupid enough to believe that proximity to beautiful, dangerous things would not eventually destroy her. She went upstairs. She lay down on top of the covers in her clothes because taking them off felt like a commitment to rest she couldn't afford. She watched the ceiling and listened for sounds that weren't there. She did not sleep at all. At 5:40, she heard Elliot's feet on the stairs and the creak of the third step, and she got up and went down to the kitchen and started the coffee and turned the lights on. And the cafe filled with the smell of morning the way it always did. And at 6, she unlocked the front door and turned the sign to open. At 8:17, the bell above the door rang. She did not look up immediately. She finished writing down Thomas Riedell's second order, and then she turned, and Adrian Vale was walking across her cafe floor in his dark coat, and his eyes found hers before he reached the table, and he stopped. He stopped walking. He looked at her for a long moment, not with the careful blankness she'd been watching for 3 weeks, but with something stripped of its mask, something that looked almost like recognition, almost like the particular grief of a man who has found the thing he lost and understands it is no longer his. Then he sat down. He said nothing. Mara walked to the corner table with her pad and her pen, and she looked down at him from 3 feet away, and she said, very quietly, so that no one else in the cafe could hear, "I know who you are." The muscles in his jaw moved, just barely. "I know," he said. "Then you know this conversation is going to happen," she said. "Today, after closing, you're going to come back here and we're going to have it." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "What time do you close?" 4. He nodded once, reached into his coat, set exact change on the table for a coffee she hadn't made yet, and stood up and walked back out the door without ordering. Through the window, she watched him stop on the gravel path. He was looking at the school bus stop at the end of the path, where Elliot was standing with his backpack, waiting, kicking at the gravel. Elliot looked up, and across the distance, through the fog, through the glass, through everything. He looked directly at Adrian Vale. Adrian Vale did not look away. And what crossed his face in that unguarded moment, what Mara saw from behind her counter in the cafe she had built with her own hands, in the quiet life she had constructed on the foundation of a secret, was not the cold calculation of a criminal or the careful blankness of a man protecting himself. It was recognition, raw, helpless, devastating recognition. The school bus arrived and Elliot climbed on and the doors closed and the bus pulled away into the fog. Adrian Vale stood on the gravel path for a moment longer. Then he walked to his car, a black Range Rover parked at the end of the lot, which she now noticed had been there every morning and she had simply never registered it. And he got in and drove away. Mara stood behind her counter with her hand pressed flat to the wood and thought, he knows. He had known for longer than she'd realized. The question was what he was going to do about it. And the second question, the one she was only now beginning to ask, was why he hadn't done it already. She had 4 hours until closing. She spent them trying to prepare for a conversation she had been running from for 9 years. By 3:15, the cafe was empty except for her. She was cleaning the counter when she heard, from outside, from the direction of the road, close, too close, a sound she had never heard in Harwick. It started as a vibration she felt in her feet before she heard it with her ears. Then the windows turned white. Then the pressure wave hit the glass hard enough to crack it. Then the sound arrived. A concussive crack that wasn't a car backfiring, wasn't a transformer blowing, wasn't any of the things a safe person's mind reaches for first. And Mara dropped below the counter because her body knew before her brain caught up. And the second crack came half a second after the first. And then the alarm down the street began to scream. And she rose slowly and looked through the cracked window at the column of black smoke rising from the direction of the main road. And she thought with a cold clarity that silenced everything else. He brought it here. He brought it here, and my son gets off that bus in 45 minutes. The smoke was black, and it climbed straight up because there was no wind. Mara stood behind her cracked window and watched it and counted. That was what she did when her body wanted to panic. She counted. Seconds, objects, exit points. She counted the distance from the counter to the kitchen door. She counted the steps from the kitchen door to the back entrance. She counted the minutes until the school bus returned Elliot to the stop at the end of the gravel path. 43 minutes. She came around the counter. She went to the front door and opened it, and the smell hit her first. Chemical and sharp, with something underneath it that was organic and wrong. Down the main road, maybe 200 meters, a car was burning. Not her car. A vehicle she didn't recognize, parked half on the curb outside the hardware store, now a column of orange and black. The hardware store's front window was gone. Glass on the pavement. A woman stood outside the post office with both hands over her mouth. A man was running toward the burning car with a fire extinguisher, which was either brave or useless, and probably both. Nobody was screaming. That was the thing about real violence. It didn't produce the sounds people expected. It produced silence, and then slow motion, and then the particular administrative chaos of people trying to remember what the steps were. Mara went back inside. She went to the kitchen, she picked up her phone and called the school. It rang 4 times. The secretary answered. Harwick Primary. This is Mara Whitmore, Elliot Voss's mother. Mrs. Whitmore? Yes? There's been an explosion on the main road. I need Elliot to stay at school until I come for him. Don't put him on the afternoon bus. A pause. Of course, Yes, we're just hearing about this now. We'll keep him in the office. Don't let anyone else pick him up. Anyone. Only me. Understood. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen with the phone in her hand and she breathed, and she thought about what she knew and what she didn't know and what the gap between those two things might cost her. What she knew, someone had bombed a building in London connected to Adrian Vale 2 months ago. 3 people dead. No arrests. Adrian Vale had then traveled to a village of 1,100 people on a lake and begun sitting in her cafe every morning. Now something had exploded 200 meters from her cafe outside her window on a Tuesday afternoon in a town where nothing ever exploded. What she didn't know, whether the explosion was connected to Adrian, whether Adrian had known it was coming, whether it was a warning or an accident or the first move in something that had no good second move. She was still standing in her kitchen when the back door opened. She spun. Her hand went to the knife block on the counter before she'd made a conscious decision about it, and she had her fingers around the handle of the largest one before the door finished swinging open, and Adrian Vale stepped through her back door with his hands visible at his sides. He looked at the knife. He looked at her face. He didn't stop moving until he was inside and the door was closed behind him. "Put it down," he said. "Get out of my kitchen. I'm trying to keep you alive. Get out." Mara. He said her name like he'd said it before, like it was a word he'd had in his mouth for a long time. "The car that burned, it's not random. They tracked a vehicle here. Mine. They didn't know exactly where I was in town, so they hit a parked car with a similar plate configuration. It's a message." She still had the knife. Her arm wasn't shaking, but it wanted to. "A message," she said. "It means they know I'm here. It means I have maybe 2 hours before they know exactly where here is. Then you need to leave." "I know. Right now." "I know," he said again. "But I need you to listen to me for 5 minutes first. I don't need anything from you. Elliot needs—" "Don't." The word came out stripped down to bone. "Don't say his name in my kitchen." Something moved across his face that she didn't want to interpret. He was still standing with his hands at his sides, which was either a gesture of submission or a very careful kind of control, and she couldn't tell which, and that was the problem with him. She had never been able to tell which. He was 41 now. She knew that from the articles. He looked at it in the way that certain men look their age without being diminished by it. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the gray beginning at his temples, the particular stillness of a man who had made so many decisions under pressure that stillness had become his default state. He had been 32 when she'd known him, when she'd been close enough to the edges of his world to understand how it worked, when she had made the worst decision of her life and the best one simultaneously, and the two decisions had been the same decision, and she had lived with that for 9 years. She put the knife down on the counter, not because she trusted him, because having it in her hand was burning energy she needed for other things. 5 minutes, she said. He exhaled, just slightly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Talk." He came further into the kitchen, but not close. He stopped at the table and put both hands flat on it, which she recognized as a deliberate gesture. A man physically anchoring himself to something because he needed the anchor. "The people who are coming," he said. "Their name is the Calder Group. They're not organized crime in the traditional sense. They're a consortium. Investment money with criminal infrastructure underneath it. They've been trying to absorb what I run for 2 years, and I've been blocking them for 2 years. And 6 weeks ago, one of my people gave them intelligence about my private movements." He paused. "Someone inside my organization." "I don't care about your organization." "They have a file on me," he said, and the way he said it made her go very still. "A comprehensive file, everything I've done in the last 15 years, my properties, my business relationships, He stopped. "People I've been connected to." The kitchen felt smaller. "How comprehensive," she said. "Comprehensive enough that they found this town." His jaw was tight. "They may have found it because of me, or they may have found it through the file. I don't know which yet. Your file connects you to me. It connects me to a woman I knew 9 years ago," he said. "Whether they know that woman is you, whether they know about Harwick specifically, I'm working to determine." "You're working to determine." The words came out flat. "You're here, in my kitchen, in the town where I have built my life, and you're working to determine whether the people trying to kill you know that I exist." "Yes." "How long have you known about Elliot?" It came out steady. She was proud of how steady it came out. He was quiet for a moment. 7 weeks. She counted backward in her head. 7 weeks put him here before the London bombing, which meant he'd come to Harwick before the Calder Group had started moving on him publicly, which meant 2 things that contradicted each other, and she needed to understand which one was true. "Did you come here because of the threat?" she said slowly. "Or did you come here before the threat started?" The pause before he answered was 2 seconds too long. "I came here because of Elliot," he said. "The threat followed me." She turned away from him. She went to the sink and stood there with her hands on the edge of it and looked out the small window above it at the back lot, at the gravel and the wood stack and the old Land Rover. You came here, she said, to a town where your enemies could follow you, and you sat in my cafe for 3 weeks, and you watched my son, and you said nothing. I didn't know how to... That's not an answer. She turned back. That's not a reason, and it's not an answer. And I need you to understand that right now, every calculation I'm making has one variable in it, and that variable is a 9-year-old boy who gets off a school bus in 39 minutes, and if anything about that calculation goes wrong, nothing is going to happen to him. You don't get to promise me that. You don't have that standing. His face was doing the thing again, the stripped thing, the mask-off thing, and she looked away from it because she couldn't afford to feel anything about it. I have 2 men outside, he said. Since this morning, they've been watching the cafe and the bus route. She stared at him. You put your people around my son without telling me. I put people around your son because the threat escalated this morning, and I wasn't without telling me. Yes. He held her gaze. Yes. I made that decision unilaterally, and you have every right to be angry about it, and we can have that argument later, but right now I need you to hear me. We need to move. I'm not going anywhere with you. Mara, I am going to get into my car, she said, with a precision that came from the same place the steady hands came from, and I'm going to drive to my son's school, and I'm going to take him somewhere safe, and you are going to get into your car and drive in the opposite direction and draw every single one of your problems away from my town. It's not that simple anymore. Make it that simple. They have your name, he said. The kitchen went very quiet. The file, he said. The comprehensive file. It doesn't just connect me to a woman I knew 9 years ago. It has your current name, your address, the cafe. His voice was careful and flat, and it cost him something to say the next thing. She could see it cost him something. And Elliot's name. She sat down. She didn't mean to. Her legs made the decision. They know about him, she said. They know a child exists who may be relevant to leverage over me. They may not know the specifics yet, but if they've connected the file to this location, then coming after him is a way to get to you. Yes. She sat at her kitchen table in her cafe at 3:20 in the afternoon and felt the architecture of 9 years come apart around her with the clean efficiency of something that had been structurally unsound for a long time and had finally found the right pressure. She had run to protect him. She had kept the secret to protect him. The secret was supposed to be the wall between her son and everything that Adrian Vale carried with him, and the wall had done nothing. It had protected nothing. It had only meant that when the danger found them, she would be standing in it alone and unprepared. How did they get the file, she said. A man named Crew. He's been with me for 6 years. He went to the Calder group 8 weeks ago with a download of everything in my private archive. A pause. I've dealt with Crew. She didn't ask what dealt with meant. She didn't need to. So someone in your organization betrayed you, she said, and you've handled that, and the Calder group still has the file, and they know where I am. They may know. I'm not certain. But the car outside the hardware store is certain. Yes. She stood up. She went to the window again. The smoke from the car had thinned to a gray thread. She could hear sirens now, late. The nearest fire station was in the next town, and it took them 20 minutes. I need to get Elliot, she said. My men can... Your men are not going near my son. She picked up her keys from the hook by the back door. Call them off the bus route. Call them off the cafe. You said you have 2 hours before they know exactly where you are. Use those 2 hours to be somewhere else. And you? Where are you going to go? That's not your business. Mara. He moved then, crossing the kitchen in 3 strides, and he stopped close enough that she could see the tension in his neck and the exhaustion that went all the way down to the bone. And he said very quietly, I know you have no reason to trust me. I know what I've walked into your life and what it's cost you to build this. I know I have no right to ask you for anything. He stopped. But I'm asking you. Let me help you get him somewhere safe. She looked at him from 2 feet away, and she thought about 19 and 20 and 21 and the version of herself that had made decisions based on feelings instead of evidence and what those decisions had produced. She thought about a man who had sat in her corner table for 3 weeks and never once made a move and never raised his voice, and who had put two men around her son's bus route on a morning when he thought danger was coming. She thought about the cracked window and the smoke and Elliot at the bus stop looking through the fog. "My son doesn't know who you are," she said. "I know. And he's not going to know. Not today. Not from you. Okay? If I let you drive us somewhere, if I make that decision, it is purely logistical. It means nothing else." "I understand." "Do you understand?" she said. "Or do you think you understand and actually you're calculating something I can't see?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Both, probably. But the part that's calculating is trying to keep you alive, and right now those are the same thing." She hated that it was a straight answer. She had wanted him to flinch or deflect so she could dismiss him cleanly. She grabbed her jacket from the hook. "You drive. I sit in the back with Elliot. If he asks questions, you say nothing. If anyone approaches the vehicle, you tell me before you respond. If I say stop, you stop." "Yes." "And after we're somewhere safe, you tell me everything. Not the version that makes you look manageable. Everything." "Yes," he said again. She opened the back door. The afternoon was gray and cold, and the smoke smell had reached the back lot. She walked to the Range Rover that was pulled up to the fence and got in the back without waiting for him, and he came around and got in the front and started the engine, and they drove to Elliot's school in silence. Elliot was waiting in the school office with his backpack in his lap, and a look on his face that was trying very hard to be unconcerned and not quite getting there. He was 9, and he was smart, and he had inherited whatever combination of instincts Mara had passed on to him that made him very good at detecting when an adult was pretending everything was fine. He looked at Mara. Then he looked at the man behind her. "This is—" Mara started. "Vale," Adrian said. "Adrian Vale. I'm a friend of your mother's." Elliot looked at him for a moment with the specific measuring quality he had, the pulled-together brows, the stillness, and then he looked back at Mara. "What happened to the cafe window?" "There was an accident on the road," she said. "We're going to stay somewhere else tonight." "Where?" "I'll explain in the car." He stood up and shouldered his backpack and walked past Adrian without a word, and Mara followed, and they went out to the Range Rover and got in. Elliot in the back with Mara, Adrian in front, and Elliot pressed his face to the window as they passed the main road and saw the burned-out shell of the car and the glass on the pavement and the 2 police vehicles parked at angles. "That's not an accident," he said quietly. Mara put her hand over his. "I know." He didn't pull away. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, even more quietly so only she could hear, "Is that man the reason?" She didn't answer. He nodded, once, and went back to looking out the window, and she understood with a helpless precision that she had underestimated him again, which she was always doing, which was the particular ongoing humiliation of raising a child who was sharper than you wanted them to be. They drove for 40 minutes, out of Harwick, through the back roads that ran along the northern lakeshore, and then up into the hills where the tourist rental properties sat empty in November. Adrian pulled into a long gravel drive without consulting GPS, which meant he'd already identified this location in advance, which meant he'd been planning for this contingency before today, which told her something she wasn't sure she wanted to know about how long he'd understood the situation to be dangerous. The house was stone, low, with a view across the valley. Inside it was clean and cold and stocked. She could see through the kitchen window that the refrigerator light was on and there were supplies on the counter. He'd had someone prepare it. And he'd said nothing to her. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen while Elliot explored the ground floor with the methodical curiosity of a child who processed anxiety through investigation, and she looked at Adrian Vale standing on the other side of the kitchen counter, and she thought about the 2 men on the bus route and the prepared safe house and the exact change on the table every morning. He had been managing this situation since before she knew there was a situation to manage. He had made decisions that affected her and her son without her knowledge or consent, and he had told himself it was protection, and he wasn't entirely wrong, which was the most infuriating possible version of wrong. "How long?" she said. He didn't pretend not to understand. "I found out about Elliot 7 weeks ago. I found out you were in Harwick the same day. I came 3 days later." "You came without telling me you were coming." "Yes." "You sat in my cafe for 3 weeks without telling me who you were." I didn't know how to start that conversation. So you watch my son instead. Something tightened in his jaw. I was trying to understand what I was looking at. He's a child. He's not a situation to be assessed. I know that. Do you? She crossed her arms. Because from where I'm standing, you've treated the last 7 weeks like an intelligence operation. You gathered information. You positioned assets. You let me walk around not knowing that people with your file were potentially closing in on my town while you decided at what point to disclose. He was quiet. I had reasons, he said finally. Tell me the reasons. I didn't know if you'd run. She stared at him. If I'd come to you in week 1, he said, and told you who I was and why I was there and what I'd found, I didn't know if you'd take Elliot and disappear, go somewhere I couldn't find. And He stopped. He looked at the counter. I wasn't ready for that. The kitchen was very quiet. So you delayed, she said. You weighed your need to not lose access to your son against my right to know that danger was following you, and you chose your need. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Adrian. She said his name, and he looked up. You don't have a son yet. You have a biological connection to a child who doesn't know you exist. What you have does not supersede what I have. It does not supersede his safety or my right to make decisions about it. Do you understand that? Yes, he said. The word came out rough. Good. Elliot appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at both of them with the careful, deliberate look that meant he'd been listening from the hallway. There are 3 bedrooms, he said. And someone left food in the fridge. He paused. Are we hiding? Mara opened her mouth. Yes, Adrian said. She looked at him sharply. He looked at Elliot. Some people who don't like me know that I've been spending time in your town. We're here until it's safe to go back. Elliot absorbed this. People who don't like you, like enemies. Yes. Do they know about us? A beat. We're being cautious. Elliot looked at Mara. She held his gaze and gave him the small nod that meant true, but not the whole truth. He'd learned to read that nod at age 7. He nodded back. Okay, he said, and went to explore the rest of the house. Mara watched him go. She stood in the kitchen with Adrian Vale and the weight of 9 years between them, and she said nothing for a long moment. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, educated, unhurried, the voice of a man who is accustomed to being listened to. Ms. Whitmore, it said, my name is not important. What is important is that you understand your current situation. Mr. Vale has brought his problems to your door. He has done this because he values something in your proximity. We believe we understand what that something is. We want you to know that our interest is in Mr. Vale exclusively. If you were to encourage him to come to a specific location at a specific time, your involvement in this matter would end permanently. Your son would be of no further concern to anyone. She kept her eyes on the kitchen window. The valley below was going dark. How did you get this number? She said. Ms. Whitmore, we got everything. The line went dead. She lowered the phone. Adrian was watching her. He had read her face during the call. She could see that he'd read it, and his expression had changed to something that was very controlled and very cold. They called you, he said. Yes. What did they want? She looked at him across the kitchen, the man she had run from and the man who had found her and the man whose enemies now had her phone number, and she felt the last exit point close behind her like a door she would not be able to reopen. They want me to give them a location for you, she said, in exchange for leaving Elliot out of it. He was very still. They're offering me a way out, she said, if I hand you over. The silence stretched between them, and in it she watched him understand that she was not telling him this because she had already decided. She was telling him because she had not decided, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and they both knew that the next thing either of them said would either build something or destroy it, and there was no version of this moment that didn't cost someone everything. From the upstairs hallway came the sound of Elliot's footsteps, moving room to room, mapping the dimensions of a place he hadn't chosen and didn't yet understand, the way he always moved through new spaces. Methodical, patient, already looking for the shape of things. Adrian Vale stood in the kitchen of a house he'd prepared for a contingency he'd hoped wouldn't come. And he looked at the mother of his son, and he said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that would make the offer she'd just received disappear from the room. She had it. The exit. Clean, explicit, and offered by people who had already demonstrated they could blow up a car 200 meters from her window without hesitating. She had a 9-year-old boy upstairs mapping the rooms of a safe house he hadn't chosen, and she had a man across the kitchen who had lied by omission for 7 weeks and brought his war to her door, and the math was not complicated. Except it was. Because the people who had just called her were people who blew up cars on quiet streets and had comprehensive files on innocent women and their children, and a promise made by people like that was worth exactly nothing. Today, they wanted Adrian. Tomorrow, when Adrian was gone, they would still have her number. They would still have Elliot's name in a file somewhere. They would still be people who operated the way these people operated, and leave your son out of it was a sentence that meant whatever was convenient at the time it was spoken. She knew that. She had known it before the call ended. Adrian hadn't moved. He was watching her with the stillness that she'd cataloged for 3 weeks across a cafe floor, and she understood now that the stillness wasn't coldness. It was the particular restraint of a man who had learned that pushing made everything worse, and so had trained himself to wait, and that the training had cost him more than the waiting. "I'm not going to give them a location," she said. Something in his shoulders changed, almost imperceptible. "Not because I trust you," she said. "Because I don't trust them. And because Elliot's name is in their file and a deal with people like that isn't a deal, it's a delay." "Yes," he said. "So we are in this together whether I want that or not." "Yes." "Then here's what I need from you." She set her phone face down on the counter. "No more decisions made without me. No more men positioned around my son without my knowledge. No more prepared contingencies that I walk into blind. We are now operating together or we are not operating at all. And if you make one unilateral move without telling me first, I will take Elliot and I will disappear in a direction that even your resources will not be able to follow. Are we clear?" He held her gaze. "Clear." Upstairs, Elliot's footsteps stopped. Then his voice came down the stairwell, careful and quiet, the way he spoke when he already suspected the answer. "Mom, there's a car parked on the road at the end of the drive with its lights off." Mara looked at Adrian. Adrian was already moving. The car had its lights off, and it was parked at an angle that blocked the lower half of the driveway, which meant whoever was in it had arrived after them and had done so quietly and had positioned themselves not to observe but to prevent exit. Those were 3 separate pieces of information, and Adrian processed all 3 in the time it took him to cross from the kitchen to the foot of the stairs. "Elliot," his voice was level. "Come down. Now. Bring your bag." Mara was already at the window, angled to the side of it, looking down the drive without putting her silhouette in the glass. The car was a dark sedan, late model, and she couldn't see movement inside it from this distance, but the absence of movement was its own kind of information. People sitting very still in a parked car in the dark were people who had been trained to sit still. Elliot came down the stairs with his backpack on both shoulders, his face doing the thing where it was very calm on the surface because the surface was all he could control. He looked at Adrian. He looked at Mara. "Back door," Adrian said, not to either of them specifically. He was moving through the kitchen to the rear of the house, and Mara put her hand between Elliot's shoulder blades and moved him forward. The back door opened onto a stone terrace and then a slope of wet grass that ran down to a tree line 40 meters out. The valley below was dark. No lights on the back approach. Adrian stood on the terrace for 3 seconds, reading the darkness the way a man reads something he's read before, and then he moved left along the terrace wall toward the low stone outbuilding that sat adjacent to the house. "There's a vehicle in there," he said quietly. "A backup." "You prepared 2 exits," Mara said. "Yes." She wanted to be angry about it. She filed it away instead. The outbuilding was unlocked. A stone barn converted to storage, smelling of oil and cold concrete. Inside, under a canvas tarp, was a Land Cruiser, older than the Range Rover, the kind of vehicle that existed in the countryside without attracting comment. Adrian pulled the tarp off and found the keys above the driver's side visor and handed them to Mara without discussion, which she understood to mean he wanted his hands free. "You drive," he said. "Where?" "North. There's a property outside Keswick. Takes 40 minutes if you stay off the main road." "I'll direct you." "And the people in the car at the end of the drive?" "They may not know about this exit. We have 3 minutes to find out." Elliot was already in the back seat. He had not said a word since coming downstairs, and his silence was the loudest thing in the barn. Mara got in the driver's seat, and Adrian got in the passenger side, and she started the engine. It turned over rough and then settled, and she rolled it out of the barn without lights and across the wet grass toward the tree line, where a track ran parallel to the property's edge before joining a farm road half a kilometer north. She knew how to drive without lights. She had learned that in a different life, and she had hoped never to use it again. The track was rutted, and the cruiser bucked on it, and she kept her speed at 15 and her eyes on the gray-on-gray shapes of the trees and the fence posts, and behind them the stone house sat quiet and dark, and the sedan at the end of the drive did not move. They reached the farm road. She turned north. She turned the lights on. "They didn't follow," Elliot said from the back seat. "Not yet," Adrian said. "That means they're waiting for something." Adrian turned to look at him. A long look, the kind that had nothing tactical in it. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what it means." Elliot nodded and went back to watching the road behind them through the rear window, and Mara drove north with her hands at 10 and 2 and her jaw aching from holding it set. And she thought about the sedan parked at the end of the drive with its lights off, waiting, and what it was waiting for. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it in the cup holder. Unknown number again. She let it buzz. It stopped, then started again. "Answer it," Adrian said. "I don't take instructions from—" "Mara, answer it." Something in his voice. Not urgency. Adrian Vale did not do urgency in any ordinary sense. Something tighter than that. Something that sounded like a man who had just understood something and didn't like what he understood. She picked up the phone and hit speaker. "You left through the back," the unhurried voice said. "Resourceful. The car at the front was meant to encourage exactly that. You're on the B5322 heading north. The Land Cruiser belongs to a shell company registered to a holding entity in Gibraltar that traces back to Mr. Vale's network in 4 steps. We did the 4 steps before you got in the vehicle." Mara's hands tightened on the wheel. "What do you want?" she said. "We want what we've always wanted, Mr. Vale. The offer to you remains open, but I want to be transparent with you, Ms. Whitmore, because I think you're an intelligent woman who deserves transparency." A pause. Deliberate. Practiced. "The property outside Keswick that Mr. Vale is directing you toward is known to us. It was identified in the crew file. If you arrive there, we will be waiting. If you deviate from this road and attempt another route, we have enough coverage in this region to locate you within 20 minutes. Another pause. "You're not escaping. You're choosing the terms of how this ends." The line stayed open. The voice waited. Mara looked at Adrian. His face had done something she hadn't seen it do before. It had gone past the controlled stillness into something harder and more hollow underneath. And she realized with a cold drop in her stomach that he had not known about the Keswick property being in the file. He had planned to go there. He had been directing her there. And the people on this phone had just told him, through her, that his contingency plan was already known, had been known, which meant the crew file was more comprehensive than he'd understood, which meant the man who had compiled it had given them not just the past, but the architecture of Adrian's future moves. "How much of the file is crew's direct knowledge?" Adrian said. His voice was flat, speaking past her to the phone. "Ah," the voice said. "Mr. Vale." "All of it, I'm afraid. Mr. Crew was thorough. 6 years of access produces a comprehensive picture. Crew didn't know about the Gibraltar entity. That was established after he left. Mr. Crew left 7 weeks ago. The Gibraltar entity was established 9 weeks ago. He had it. A beat. He had everything, Mr. Vale. That's what you paid for when you hired him. Unfortunately, it's also what we paid for." Adrian put his hand on the dashboard. Flat, the same way he'd put it on the kitchen table. Anchoring. "The Keswick property is burned," he said, quiet, to Mara. Not to the phone. "I gathered," she said. "Hang up. She hit end call. The road unwound in the headlights, empty, wet, bordered by dark fields. "Where do we go?" she said. He was quiet for 5 seconds. She counted them. "I need to think." "You have until the next junction." "I know." Elliot leaned forward from the back seat. "The man on the phone said 20 minutes to find us if we go off route. That means they don't have immediate coverage on this road, or they'd have said 10 minutes. We have a window." Mara and Adrian both looked at him. "He's right," Adrian said. "Don't tell him he's right," Mara said. "He'll never stop." But she was already running the math, and so was Elliot. And the math was the same math. 20 minutes meant a gap in their surveillance net, which meant if she turned off this road within the next 3 minutes and went somewhere that wasn't in any file, somewhere that had no connection to Adrian Vale, no connection to Gibraltar entities or shell companies or 6 years of Crew's meticulous intelligence gathering, they might be able to break the tracking logic entirely, somewhere that was only hers. She knew one place. She didn't want to use it. She had kept it separate from everything, from the cafe, from the life she'd built, from any paper trail, because she had always known, in the part of herself that never fully stopped running, that she might need it one day. A small property outside a village called Brathe, 20 minutes west of where they were, that she'd leased under a name she'd used once and never again, paid in cash through a solicitor who'd retired and moved to Portugal 2 years ago. Not in any file. Not connected to Mara Whitmore. Not connected to anyone. She turned off the B5322 at the next junction without telling Adrian where she was going. He noted the turn but said nothing. She drove west on roads that got smaller and darker, and she did not look at her phone. And after 22 minutes, she pulled down a lane so narrow the hedges scraped both mirrors and stopped in front of a stone cottage that was completely dark. "Whose property is this?" Adrian said. "Mine," she said. "In a name you've never heard." He looked at her in the dark of the car, and she could see him recalibrating, adding this information to whatever picture he'd built of her, understanding that she had layers he hadn't mapped. And she was glad. She wanted him off balance. She wanted him to understand that for 9 years she had been building redundancies he didn't know about, and that the woman he'd sat across from in the cafe for 3 weeks was not the entirety of what she was. She got them inside. The cottage was cold and smelled of disuse. Stone walls, low ceilings, a fireplace she didn't light because light through the windows was a signal. She found blankets in the chest at the foot of the single bedroom and gave them to Elliot and told him to sleep in the bedroom, which he accepted without argument, which told her how tired he was because Elliot without energy was Elliot without argument, and he was 9 years old and had been holding himself together for 6 hours. She waited until she heard his breathing change through the thin door. Then she turned to Adrian, who was standing by the cold fireplace with his phone in his hand and his face doing the hollow thing again. "Tell me about Crew," she said. "I told you about Crew." "You told me what Crew did. I want to know who Crew was before he did it." He set his phone face up on the mantel. The screen was lit with a conversation. Text, fast-moving. Someone on his end still working. "Crew came to me through a man named Harlan Voss," he said. She felt the name before she understood why. It moved through her like cold water. The last name first, recognizable and wrong in this context, and then the first name, and then the combination, and then the specific memory that the combination unlocked. Harlan Voss. She sat down on the stone hearth. "Say that name again," she said. Adrian looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Harlan Voss. He ran the Eastern logistics for my operation for 3 years. He recommended Crew directly. I should have... He stopped. "Why are you sitting down?" "Harlan Voss," she said. 50, approximately. American accent, originally. Scar on the left hand between the thumb and forefinger. The room was very quiet. "You know him," Adrian said. "Elliot's last name," she said, "is Voss." Adrian did not move. "I used it because it was the most ordinary name I could think of that wasn't mine," she said, and her voice was coming from somewhere very far away. "I needed a name for the school enrollment, for the lease, for the NHS registration. Something that wouldn't trace back to either of us. I picked it because I'd heard it once, years ago, in a context I barely remembered, and it seemed safe." She stopped. Where did you hear it? Adrian said. His voice had gone to a very particular register, quiet and precise, the voice of a man closing in on something he didn't want to be closing in on. From you, she said, 9 years ago. You mentioned a Harlan Voss once, in passing, someone on the periphery of your network, someone you trusted. The silence in the cottage was complete. He found Elliot's name in the school records, Adrian said. Not a question. Working it out in real time, each word placed carefully. Voss. An unusual enough name in an English lake town to flag. He was already feeding information to the Calder group. He was the one who brought Crew to me, which means he's been inside my organization longer than Crew, which means he's been... He stopped. He pressed 2 fingers to his mouth. He's been building toward this for years. Crew was a tool. Voss is the architect. And Voss found Elliot's name, Mara said, and gave it to the Calder group. And the Calder group understood that a child named Voss connected to a woman from my past was not a coincidence. They know, he said. They've known since before I found out. Voss led me to Elliot. He fed me the intelligence about Elliot because he knew I would come here. He knew I would come here, and he knew the Calder group would follow me, and he knew... He stopped again. He turned away. He put both hands on the mantel and stood there with his head down. He used you, Mara said. He used your need to find your son to lead an armed group to my door. Adrian said nothing. He used your son, she said, as bait. The word landed in the room and stayed there. She watched Adrian Vale, who controlled businesses across 6 countries, who had spent 20 years being the most dangerous thing in any room he entered, who had made decisions about life and money and consequence that she couldn't fully comprehend. She watched him stand at the cold mantel of a cottage he didn't know existed an hour ago and absorb the information that someone he had trusted for years had orchestrated the exposure of a child he had only just found. His hands on the mantel were white at the knuckles. How good is Voss? She said. As an operator. Very good. Is he with the Calder group now, or is he independent? I don't know yet. He straightened. He picked up his phone, read the screen. His expression went flat in a new way. Not the controlled flatness she'd been watching for weeks, but something underneath it, something that had been sitting below all the management and all the restraint, and was now coming up because the situation had burned through every layer of cover he'd built over it. He turned the phone so she could see the screen. A message from someone in his network. 4 words and a photograph. The 4 words were, Voss was here tonight. The photograph was the stone house in the hills, the backup property, the one with the sedan at the end of the drive. Voss had been in that car. Voss had watched them leave through the back. Voss had let them go. She looked at Adrian. He let us run. He's not trying to catch us, Adrian said. He's trying to hurt us. He wants us to go somewhere specific, and he's closing off options until we go there. He looked at the phone, the Keswick property. He burned it on the phone call to make sure we didn't go there, which means Keswick is the one place he doesn't control, which means if we'd gone to Keswick, we'd have had an advantage he didn't want us to have. So he warned us away from the one place we should have gone. Yes. By pretending it was compromised. Yes. She stood up. We need to go to Keswick. There may be Calder people there already. The call may have been partly true. Keswick may be known to them even if Voss wanted us away from it. So we might be driving into a trap. We might be driving away from a worse one. She looked at the bedroom door. Behind it, her son was asleep under 2 blankets in a house she'd kept secret for years, which was now compromised because she'd driven to it under surveillance with a man whose enemy had been tracking them for weeks. She had 1 card left, 1 location that was clean, and she'd just used it. If we go to Keswick, she said, and Voss has people there. I have people there too, Adrian said. I have 3 men at the Keswick property who have been there since this morning and who are not in any file because I brought them in after Crew left and their connection to me is personal, not organizational. He paused. They're the only assets I have left that Voss doesn't know about. 3 men. 3 good men. She thought about it. She thought about Elliot asleep behind the thin door in the sedan in the hills, and Voss in that sedan watching them run and calculating exactly where the pressure would push them next. The thing about being herded was that it only worked if you went where the herder expected. Voss had built an elaborate architecture to push them in a specific direction. He had burned the escape route systematically and left one road open, which meant walking down the open road was the last thing they should do, and also possibly the only thing they could do. And the difference between those two things was 3 men in Keswick that Voss didn't know existed. "Wake Elliot," she said. "Mara." "I said wake him. We're not leaving him here alone, and we're not splitting up, and if I've got 30 seconds of lead time on Voss's next move, I want to use all 30 seconds. She was already moving to the bedroom door. "And Adrian." She stopped with her hand on the frame. "When this is over, when Elliot is safe and this is finished, you and I are going to sit down and you are going to tell me every name, every connection, every piece of your world that could ever find its way back to my son, every single one. And then we are going to make decisions together about what that means." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Not you, not me. Together." He held her gaze. "Yes." She opened the bedroom door. Elliot was not asleep. He was sitting up in the dark with his backpack already on, waiting, in the particular way of a child who had been listening through a thin door to everything and had understood more of it than anyone had intended, and who had decided at 9 years old, in a cold cottage in the dark hills above a lake, that he was going to be ready for whatever came next, whether or not the adults in the next room thought he was old enough to handle it. Mara stood in the doorway and looked at her son, the backpack on his shoulders, the set of his jaw, the dark hair that would not lie flat, and felt something move through her that was beyond fear and beyond love, and was some compound of both that didn't have a name. "You heard," she said, "most of it. Elliot, the man named Voss used my last name to find us. He said it flat, the way he processed difficult things. Strip it to its components, look at each one. My last name that you picked. That wasn't your fault." "No," she said. "It wasn't. And we're going to Keswick." "Yes." He stood up. "Then we should go." She crossed the room and put both hands on his face and made him look at her directly, and she said, "I need you to do exactly what I say tonight. No questions, no negotiating. Whatever I tell you to do, you do it immediately. Can you give me that?" He looked at her for a moment. "Only tonight?" "Elliot." "Yes," he said. "I can give you that." She held his face 1 second longer than she needed to. Then she let go, and they went back into the main room where Adrian was already by the door with his phone and his coat and his 3 men in Keswick that Voss didn't know about, and Mara picked up her keys and looked at him and said, "I drive." He nodded. No argument. They went out into the cold, dark lane, the 3 of them, and got into the Land Cruiser, and Mara turned it back toward the road while Elliot watched the hedgerows, and Adrian watched his phone, and nobody spoke. Somewhere behind them, in a dark sedan on a hill above a stone house, Harlan Voss was watching a tracker that had just gone cold, and Mara understood with a cold satisfaction that for the first time tonight he didn't know exactly where they were. 20 minutes. Maybe less. She pressed the accelerator down and the old engine growled and the dark road opened up ahead of them, and whatever was waiting in Keswick, trap or salvation or some ugly combination of both, was now the only direction left. She drove toward it without flinching, because that was what she did. That was the particular terrible skill she had never been able to leave behind, no matter how many quiet mornings she'd tried to build on top of it. She drove toward the thing that was trying to break her, and she did not look back. The road to Keswick was 31 minutes in the dark without traffic, and Mara drove it in 24. She didn't speak. Adrian didn't speak. Elliot sat behind them with his backpack in his lap and his eyes on the road ahead, and the only sounds were the engine and the wet tarmac under the tires, and occasionally Adrian's phone buzzing with messages he read and didn't read aloud. She didn't ask him to. She was driving, and that was the entirety of what she could afford to be doing. Hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, the rest of her mind running the variables in a loop that kept producing the same output. They were moving toward an unknown situation with 3 assets Adrian trusted and 1 route in, and the knowledge that Harlan Voss was behind them recalculating. The Keswick property was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture from the word property, something like the stone house in the hills, isolated, anonymous. What Adrian directed her to was a converted warehouse on the eastern edge of the town, industrial in its bones, the kind of building that stored things and didn't advertise what. The shuttered loading bay, the unmarked door, the single light above it that was on, which Adrian said meant his people were inside and the perimeter was clean. She parked in the loading bay and killed the engine. "Stay here," Adrian said. "No," she and Elliot said simultaneously. He looked at them both. He didn't argue. He got out and knocked on the unmarked door in a pattern. 3, pause, 2, and after 7 seconds the door opened and a man filled the frame. Broad, mid-40s, a face like something carved from practical considerations rather than aesthetics. He looked at Adrian and then past him at Mara and Elliot. "Both of them?" he said. "Both of them," Adrian said. "This is Reese. He's been with me for 11 years, and he's not in any file that Voss compiled because I met him before Voss and because Reese doesn't exist on paper." Reese looked at Mara. "Ma'am." "Don't," she said. He almost smiled. He held the door, and they went inside. The warehouse was one large space broken into functional zones. A table with laptops and equipment on one side, a cleared area in the center, 2 other men she didn't know stationed at opposite ends with sightlines to the 2 entry points. Heat from portable units, the smell of coffee, and something electronic. It looked like what it was, a position held by professionals who had done this before. Adrian went to the table. He stood over one of the laptops, and the man at it, younger, sharp-featured, introduced by nobody, turned the screen so Adrian could see and began talking in a low voice. Mara moved close enough to hear. "Voss pinged the cottage location 11 minutes ago," the young man said. "He's moving. We have a tail on his vehicle. He's not heading here directly. He's heading to a staging point 2 kilometers south. We think he's meeting the Calder units." "How many Calder units?" Adrian said. "In the region tonight? We're reading 4 vehicles. Could be 2 men per vehicle. Could be more. 8 to 10 operators. Minimum." Adrian straightened. He put both hands on the table edge and looked at the map on the screen. The town, the roads, the 2 kilometers south where a dot was moving. And Mara watched him run the same kind of calculation she'd been running in the car. And she watched him arrive at the same place she'd arrived at 20 minutes ago on the dark road. They were not in a position to run anymore because every route out had a door closing across it, and the only play left was to stop moving and make the people coming toward them come to a place of their choosing. "They'll hit this location within the hour," Adrian said. 40 minutes, Reese said from behind them. "If Voss knows this address." "He may not. It wasn't in the crew file. But if he's had eyes on us since the cottage..." "He had eyes on us since the cottage," Mara said. They both looked at her. "The sedan in the hills. He watched us leave. He had a tracker on the Land Cruiser. He said as much on the phone call. But I drove the back roads and the tracker went cold. He doesn't know we came here. He knows we went west and then off-grid." "Which means he's guessing," the young man at the laptop said. "Which means we have something," Mara said. "Not much, but something." Adrian looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Reese. "Get the boy somewhere internal. No windows." "He stays with me," Mara said. "Mara, he stays with me or I'm not functional. Those are the terms." Reese looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at Mara. Then he nodded. Once. "There's a back room. No exterior walls. You both stay in it unless I come for you personally." "And if someone else comes?" He reached into the back of his belt and produced a compact pistol and held it out to her across the table. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Do you know how to use it?" he said. "Yes." She took it. Checked it the way someone checks a thing they haven't held in years but whose mechanics are still in the hands because the hands remember. It was loaded and the safety was on, and she put it in her jacket pocket and said, "Don't let it come to that. I'm going to do everything I can." "That's not the same as a promise." "No," he said. "It's not." She took Elliot to the back room. It was small. Shelving on 3 walls, a concrete floor, a single overhead light. He sat on an overturned crate and put his backpack between his feet and looked at the shape of the pistol in her jacket pocket without commenting on it. "How long have you known how to use one of those?" he said. "Since before you were born." Why? Because I grew up in circumstances where it was useful knowledge. He absorbed this. You never told me that. No. What else haven't you told me? She sat on the crate across from him. The shelving behind him held industrial supplies, cable ties, brackets, boxes of fixings. The light above them hummed. From the main space she could hear movement, low voices, the sound of the situation being organized. A lot, she said. Things I thought I was protecting you from. Like the man outside. Yes. He's my father. Not a question. The flattest possible statement of a thing that had clearly been sitting in him for longer than tonight. She looked at her son. Yes, she said. He nodded. His hands were folded on top of his backpack, and he looked at them. I figured it out on the drive to the safe house, the first one. He looked at me and He stopped. I recognized something, which is a strange thing to say. It's not strange, she said quietly. Were you ever going to tell me? The question deserved a real answer. She owed him that. I don't know, she said. I told myself I was protecting you. I told myself his world was too dangerous, and that keeping you away from it was the only right decision. And that was true. It was true. She paused. But it was also easier, and I used the true part to avoid looking at the easier part. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is he a bad person? He's a person, she said, who has done bad things and is trying to do something different tonight. That's about as honest as I can be. Elliot looked up. That's more honest than you usually are. I know. From the main space, a shout, then movement, then the sharp, flat sound of the warehouse's outer door being hit hard from outside. Mara was on her feet before the echo finished. She pushed Elliot behind her and put her back to the shelving, and the backroom door was open 6 inches, and through it she could see the main space in fragments. Reese moving toward the main entrance, the young man at the laptop pulling it to the floor and drawing. The third man crossing to the secondary entrance on the far wall. Then the secondary entrance blew inward. Not an explosion. A ram, mechanical and fast. And the door came off its upper hinge and the third man went sideways with it. And 2 figures came through before he'd hit the ground. And then the main entrance came open simultaneously, and Mara understood with the cold clarity of someone who had been in bad rooms before that this was a coordinated entry. Both points at once, which meant they'd had the location and the layout and enough people to hit both doors in the same second. Voss had known. He'd known the whole time. The backroom door was still open 6 inches, and she could see Adrian, in the center of the space, not behind cover, standing in the open with his hands at his sides, which she didn't understand until she saw why. Because the man who had come through the main entrance and was now 10 feet from Adrian, with 2 others fanning out behind him, was not a Calder operative. It was Harlan Voss, 50, approximately, gray at the temples. The scar on his left hand that she'd described in the cottage kitchen. He was dressed plainly, dark jacket, work boots, and he moved through the warehouse with the specific ownership of a man arriving somewhere he has been before, which, of course, he had, because, of course, he had been here. He had probably been here before it was Adrian's. He had probably identified it as a fallback position years ago and filed it and waited. Reese was on the ground, not dead. She could see him moving, reaching, but there was blood on his face and he wasn't up. The young man at the laptop had been disarmed and was against the wall with one of Voss's people behind him. The third man was down at the secondary entrance and not moving at all, and she stopped looking at him. Adrian and Voss stood 10 feet apart in the center of the warehouse. 6 years, Adrian said. His voice was entirely level. 7, actually, Voss said. I was in position before you hired me. You just didn't know it yet. The Calder Group, amongst others. Voss looked around the space with a kind of professional appreciation. You always had good instincts for a fallback. Unfortunately, I had better ones. What do you want? Same thing I've always wanted. For you to make a choice. Voss turned back to him. You've been very difficult to corner, Adrian, but tonight you've done me the courtesy of walking into one of the few positions I actually control. So I'll be straightforward. He paused. Walk out with me. Sit down with the Calder principals. Sign the transfer documents. Your operation becomes theirs, clean, on paper, in exchange for your life, and he looked toward the back room, for the safety of the woman and her son. In the back room, Mara's hand was in her pocket. Her fingers were around the pistol. Elliot was pressed against the shelving behind her, and she could feel his breathing against her back. Fast, shallow, controlled. He was holding himself together with both hands, and she was so precise about not letting herself feel that right now. "And if I don't," Adrian said, "then we do it the other way, which is worse for everyone and doesn't change the outcome for the operation. It just changes the outcome for you and for the boy." The last two words landed in the space between them and hung there. Adrian looked at Voss for a long moment. The warehouse was very quiet. The two men flanking Voss were professional and still. Reese on the floor had stopped moving. The young man against the wall had his chin down and his eyes up. Adrian said, "Can I see him?" Voss frowned slightly. "What?" "The boy. Before I decide. I want to see him." A beat. Voss looked toward the back room. "Sentimental." "Yes," Adrian said. "Apparently." Voss made a small gesture with one hand. "Come out," it meant. And Adrian turned toward the back room door, and Mara understood in the fraction of a second before he reached it that this was not sentiment and was not weakness. It was Adrian Vale buying 60 seconds in which the geometry of the room would change because the moment the back room door opened, everyone's attention would shift, and Reese on the floor was still moving, and the young man against the wall had his hands clasped in front of him in a way that was not the posture of someone who had given up entirely. She stepped back from the door. She put the pistol behind her, pressed into Elliot's hands. "Safety is the small lever on the left side," she said. "You point it and you squeeze. You don't do it unless I tell you to." "Mum, promise me." "I promise." She stepped to the door and pushed it open. The light from the main space fell across her face, and she looked at Voss across the warehouse, and she saw him read her. A woman, a cafe owner, the mother of a child. And she saw him find nothing threatening in any of it, which was the most useful thing that could have happened. She walked into the main space, and she looked at Adrian, and he looked at her, and in the half second of that look she understood what he needed. 30 more seconds, and a reason for Voss to keep his eyes on her. "You're Voss," she said. She addressed him directly, crossing the space at a measured pace that looked like compliance and was actually triangulation, moving herself into a position that put her at 45 degrees to Voss and 90 degrees to the nearest flanking man. "You used my son's name." Voss looked at her with the unhurried attention of a man who isn't worried about her. "Not intentionally," he said. "The name was a flag. I didn't know the boy existed until the flag triggered." "But you used him anyway, once you knew." "This is business, Ms. Whitmore. The boy was leverage. He's 9 years old." "I'm aware." "Are you?" She stopped, 6 feet from him, close enough that he had to keep his eyes on her, which meant his eyes were not on Reese, who had gotten one hand under himself and was pushing up with the slow, terrible effort of a man running on the last of what he had. "He's 9 years old, and he is going to go back to Harwick and go to school and do homework at my kitchen table and get on that bus in the morning, and none of what you've built tonight changes that. You can have Adrian's signature. You can have every company and every account and every piece of paper that represents whatever he's built. Take all of it." She held Voss's gaze. "But you are going to leave my son's name out of your mouth for the rest of your life." Voss looked at her for a moment. Something almost like respect crossed his face, which made her trust him less. "I don't disagree," he said. "Once this is finished—" Reese came off the floor. He came up fast for a man with blood on his face, with the specific ugly efficiency of someone who has absorbed damage and routed around it, and he hit the nearest flanking man from behind before the man had registered he was upright, and the sound it made was not cinematic. It was blunt and wet, and the flanking man went into the wall and didn't come back off it. The second flanking man swung toward Reese. Adrian moved, not toward Voss. Toward the second flanking man from the side, faster than anything that had happened in the room so far. He covered the distance in 2 steps and hit the man's weapon arm going up, and the shot that fired went into the ceiling, and the sound of it inside the concrete space was enormous, and Mara's ears rang with it, and she had 1 second of total sensory whitewash, and then she was moving, She was moving toward the young man against the wall because he needed 2 seconds and one distraction, and he'd been watching the room the whole time he was against it. And she gave him the distraction by putting herself between him and Voss's line of sight, and he moved in those 2 seconds and got there. Voss had a weapon out. He'd had it out since the shot fired. He was tracking between Adrian and Reese and the young man, and he was very fast and very calm, and Mara looked at him across the warehouse floor and thought, he's better than all of us individually. Then the backroom door opened. Elliot stood in the doorway with her pistol in both hands, safety off, pointed at the floor because she'd told him to point it, and squeeze only when she told him to, and he was doing exactly what she'd said, and Voss saw him, and the room stopped. Everyone stopped. A 9-year-old boy in a warehouse doorway with a gun he was holding correctly in both hands, and eyes that were frightened and absolutely steady at the same time. Voss looked at Elliot. He looked at Adrian. He looked at Mara. And for the first time since he had walked through the main entrance with the ownership of a man who had planned every step, Harlan Voss looked at something he had not planned for and did not immediately know what to do with. "Put it down, son," he said. "He's not your son," Adrian said from across the room, breathing hard, the second flanking man neutralized and on the ground. His voice had something in it that Mara had not heard before. Not the careful level register, not the controlled flatness, something raw and without any management over it at all. "He's mine. And you're going to lower your weapon." Voss looked at him. "Or what?" Voss said. The warehouse held its breath. Adrian looked at Voss across 15 feet of concrete floor, with blood on his knuckles and his chest moving hard, and he said the thing that a man says when he has run out of every other kind of leverage and is standing at the exact center of what he values and is willing to pay any price to protect it. "Or I give you exactly what you came for," Adrian said. "Right now. No lawyers, no documents, no Calder principles in a conference room. You walk out of here with my word, and you know what my word is worth, that I will sign every transfer document your people put in front of me, every account, every subsidiary, everything I've built, yours clean." Voss studied him. "In exchange for them." Adrian didn't gesture. He didn't need to. "The woman, the boy. They walk out of here and they go back to their lake and their cafe and their life, and your people never touch them. Not tonight, not ever. No files, no leverage, nothing. And you, I'll go with you." The word landed in the room, and Mara felt it hit her chest like something physical. "Adrian?" she said. "Don't." He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Voss. "This is the offer. It's the only offer. You know what I'm worth to the Calder Group with my cooperation versus without it. You know the numbers. This is the transaction you came here to make." Voss was quiet for a long moment. The warehouse hummed. Somewhere outside a car passed on the road, and the sound of it was obscenely ordinary. "The boy puts the gun down," Voss said. "Elliot," Mara's voice came out steady. "Put it down." Elliot lowered the pistol to his side. His hands were shaking now that the moment had passed. She could see them shaking from across the room, but his face was still. Voss looked at Adrian. "Your word." "My word." Another silence. Then Voss lowered his weapon. Not all the way, not holstered, but down, out of the direct line. A gesture that meant, "I'm considering it," which from a man like Voss was as close to agreement as anything got in a room like this. 24 hours, Voss said. "They have 24 hours to be gone from Harwick before my people sanitize the file. After that, they don't exist to us." Agreed. Mara crossed the warehouse floor. She did not run. She walked to Adrian with the particular deliberate pace of a woman who refuses to let anyone in the room see what this is costing her, and she stopped in front of him and looked up at his face and said, very quietly, "This isn't over." "No," he said, "it's not. I'm going to come back for you." Something crossed his face, the stripped thing, the mask-off thing, and he said, "I know." She held his gaze for one more second. Then she turned and went to Elliot and put her arm around his shoulders and walked him toward the door. And she did not look back, because looking back was the thing that broke people, and she could not afford to be broken yet. She had 24 hours, and Mara Whitmore had built an entire life from less. She drove through the night with Elliot asleep against her shoulder. He had lasted 40 minutes after they left the warehouse. 40 minutes of silence in the dark road and the hum of the engine, and then his body had simply collected its debt, and he'd gone under between one breath and the next, the way children sleep when they've held themselves together past the point of endurance and the holding finally runs out. His head was heavy on her shoulder, and she drove with one hand and did not move him. She did not go back to Harwick, not yet. She drove south and then east on roads she chose at random, not running toward anything, just keeping the wheels turning while she thought. The Land Cruiser's heater worked poorly, and the cab was cold, and she could see her breath in the glow of the dashboard, and the fields on either side of the road were flat and dark, and the sky above them was beginning to separate. Black giving way to the deep gray that comes before color, the part of night that is already morning without knowing it. She had 24 hours. That was the number Voss had given her, and she had no particular reason to trust it, and no alternative but to operate as though she did. 24 hours to get Elliot somewhere safe and permanent, to close the cafe, to dismantle the life in Harwick cleanly enough that there was nothing left to come back to. She had done it before. She knew the mechanics of it. The cash she kept in the box under the kitchen floorboard, 11,000 pounds, accumulated slowly, always in small amounts, always for this contingency. The go bag in the back of the Land Rover that she'd repacked 2 weeks ago without knowing why, only that she'd felt the instinct to repack it and had learned to listen to that instinct. The name she kept in her head, not on paper anywhere, that she could use to start somewhere new. She had done it before and she could do it again. Except, she had said, "I'm going to come back for you." And he had said, "I know." She drove until 6 in the morning and then pulled into a services lot off the motorway and sat with the engine running and Elliot still asleep, and she looked at herself in the rear-view mirror for a long time. She looked at the woman who had built a life from nothing twice and was sitting here in the pre-dawn dark contemplating building it a third time, and she asked that woman, directly, without any of the usual management, "Is that what you're actually going to do?" The woman in the mirror did not answer, but her jaw was set in a way that meant the question had already been decided, and she was just catching up to the decision. She called Reese. She had his number because Adrian had made her take it before they left the warehouse, pressed it into her hand on a piece of paper along with a second number, and said, "Use the first one if you need anything. Use the second one only if the first one doesn't answer." And she had taken it the way she took everything from Adrian Vale, with full awareness that it was both useful and complicated. Reese answered on the second ring. His voice was rough but functional. "Miss Whitmore, I told you not to." "Right. Mara." "Where is he?" A pause, long enough to mean something. They moved him to a location in the city, London. The Calder people have a facility. It's not a prison, it's a controlled environment. He's not in physical danger. They want the transfers processed, and they want his cooperation getting access to certain accounts that require his biometrics. It'll take 3 to 4 days to complete. And after it's complete, the pause this time was longer. That's the part he negotiated and the part I don't fully trust. She closed her eyes. They said his life. They said his life in exchange for his cooperation. The Calder Group is a business, not a cartel. Killing him after the transfer creates problems. It attracts attention. It invites retaliation from his remaining people. It's messy. The cleaner move is to leave him alive and simply diminished. Diminished. Without his operation, without his money, without leverage. Another pause. He'd be nobody, which is safer for them than a martyr. She opened her eyes. The sky outside the windshield was beginning to go pale. Elliot shifted against her shoulder but didn't wake. "Voss," she said. "What about him?" "He's the one I don't trust, not the Calder principles. Voss has been running a 7-year operation, and he just watched his primary target walk out of a warehouse with the prize intact. That's not a man who accepts diminished outcomes." Reese was quiet. She could hear him breathing. "No," he said finally. "It's not. What do you need to get to him?" "To Adrian?" "To Voss." A longer silence. Then, "What are you asking me?" I'm asking you what it would take to remove Voss from the equation before he decides that a live Adrian Vale is a liability he didn't agree to. That's... He stopped, started again. That's a significant ask. I know what it is. I'm asking anyway. I have 2 men left. One of them is concussed. The other one is 26 years old and capable but not seasoned. I'm not asking you to go to war. I'm asking you to be precise. Voss is one man operating outside his organization's sanction. He built this for himself, not for the Calder Group. They hired him as an intermediary. If he overreaches after the transaction is complete, they'll cut him loose, which means he has a window, 3 or 4 days, same as the transfer, to do something that the Calder Group will have to accept as done. And you want to close the window before it opens. Reese was quiet for a very long time. She listened to the motorway traffic behind the services, the early trucks heading south. I'm going to need something from Adrian's private reserve, Reese said finally. A piece of information that Voss doesn't know Reese has. Something that gives me standing to approach certain people who would very much like to know that Voss has been running a private operation inside a Calder contract. You want to give Voss to the Calder Group. I want to give Voss's private agenda to the Calder Group. Let them clean their own house. It removes him without creating a war, and it actually makes the transfer cleaner for everyone, which means the principals have every reason to cooperate. She thought about it. It was the kind of move that Adrian would have made, layered, using existing forces rather than generating new ones, turning the machinery of the situation against itself. She thought about how easily she had understood it, and what that meant about who she had become in 9 years of being careful. Do it, she said. I'll need 48 hours. You have 36. After that, the transfer window starts closing and Voss gets nervous. 36, he said. Not arguing, just recording the number. She hung up. She sat in the services lot and watched the sky go from gray to pale and thought about 36 hours and what she needed to do inside them. Then she gently shifted Elliot upright in the seat and buckled his seatbelt without waking him and drove back toward Harwick. The fog was on the lake when she arrived. Of course it was. It was always on the lake. It came off the water in the pre-dawn the same way it always had, slow and deliberate and without any awareness of what had happened in the hills and the warehouse and the dark roads while it was doing what it always did. The café sat at the edge of it, its windows catching the early gray light, and she pulled up to the back entrance and sat for a moment looking at it. 4 years. She had built this in 4 years. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen she had fixed herself and looked at the coffee machine she had learned to use from a manual she'd found in a drawer, and the floors she had laid 3 times before. They were something she wasn't ashamed of, and she felt the weight of it. Not grief, not yet, something denser than grief. The specific heaviness of something that is over before you are ready for it to be over. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and drank it while Elliot slept upstairs. And when the first light came properly through the windows, she went up and sat on the edge of his bed and put her hand on his shoulder. He woke the way he always woke. Slow, one-eyed, processing. We're home, he said. For now. He sat up. He looked at her with the clarity that sleep had given him. The specific clarity of a child who has processed things overnight without knowing he was processing them and has arrived somewhere different from where he went under. We're leaving Harwick, he said. Yes. Because of the 24 hours? Yes. He looked at the window, at the fog on the lake. He had lived here since he was 5 and he had his friends at school and his route to the bus stop and the particular ownership of a child who has grown up in one place and knows it in his body. She watched him sit with that, and she did not try to soften it. Where are we going? He said. I don't know yet. Somewhere good. Will he come? She looked at her son, at the dark hair and the stubborn jaw and the things about his face she had spent 9 years not accounting for. I don't know that yet either, she said, but I'm working on it. He nodded. He pulled back the covers and put his feet on the floor with the deliberate motion of someone who has decided to be in motion. Then I'll pack. Elliot. He stopped. I'm sorry, she said, for the things I kept from you that I should have told you, for making you carry things by yourself that you didn't have to carry alone. He looked at her for a moment. His face was very still and very young and very old at the same time, the combination that had always undone her about him. "I know why you did it," he said. "That doesn't make it—" "I know why you did it," he said again, firmer. Not absolving her, not dismissing it, just naming it as something he had already placed, something he'd already found the shelf for in the architecture of who he was. "We can talk about it later. Right now, I need to pack." She let him go. She spent the morning doing what needed to be done. She called the dairy supplier and canceled the standing order. She called the property management company and gave notice, a month's rent in lieu, which they accepted without enthusiasm but without obstruction. She made a list of the equipment and the inventory and what could be sold and what couldn't, and she called a man in the next town who ran a catering supply business and who had been trying to buy her espresso machine for 2 years, and she sold it to him at a fair price, and arranged for collection that afternoon. Thomas Riddell came at 6 as always. He found the door unlocked and came in and saw the state of things. The notice on the counter, the equipment being staged for removal, and he stood in the middle of the cafe floor with his newspaper under his arm and his face doing something careful. "I heard there was trouble yesterday," he said. "There was." "Are you all right?" "Getting there." He looked around the cafe. At the floor she had laid 3 times. At the windows she had cleaned every morning for 4 years. At the corner table in the back where a man had sat every morning for 3 weeks and changed everything without saying a word. "I'll miss this place," he said. "So will I." He put his newspaper on the counter. "Coffee's still on?" "Last pot," she said. "On the house." He sat at his table by the door and she made him his coffee and brought it to him, and he said thank you and went back to his newspaper, and she stood behind the counter of her cafe for the last time and watched the fog on the lake and listened to the quiet machinery of a Tuesday morning in a town of 1,100 people. And she let herself feel all of it, the weight and the texture and the smell of it, because she had learned that the only way to leave something cleanly was to feel it fully first, and she was a woman who had learned to do things cleanly. At 11 o'clock her phone rang. "Reese, it's done," he said. "Earlier than I said." She set down the glass she was wrapping. "Tell me." "I made contact with the Calder principals last night through a back channel they know is clean. I gave them the documentation of Voss's private operation, everything he'd been running parallel to their contract for 3 years, including assets he'd been siphoning into his own structure instead of the consortium's. They were not pleased." A pause. "Voss was detained by his own clients at 4 this morning. He won't be in a position to create problems for anyone." She let out a breath. "Adrian. Released an hour ago, the Calder principals are pragmatic people. With Voss gone, the picture changes. They got what they wanted from the transfer documents. Their internal problem is solved, and a live cooperative Adrian Vale who owes them a debt is more valuable than a complicated situation." Another pause. "He asked me to call you." "Where is he, Mo?" "Still in London. There are things he needs to do, people he needs to speak to, and accounts he needs to close properly. It'll take a few days." "Is he safe?" "For the moment, yes." She looked around the cafe, at the notice on the counter and the equipment staged for collection, and the corner table with 4 chairs and no one sitting in it. "Tell him," she said, and then she stopped because she wasn't sure what she wanted Reese to tell him, and she stood there in the quiet of her almost empty cafe, working out the sentence. "Tell him we're going to be in a town called Grasmere," she said finally. "There's a guest house on the main street that takes long-term lets. Tell him we'll be there when he's done with what he needs to do. And tell him—" She stopped again. "Tell him to knock. Don't let himself in. I'll decide whether to open the door." Reese was quiet for a moment. She thought she heard something almost like warmth in the silence. "I'll tell him," he said. She hung up. She finished wrapping the glasses and put them in the box and carried the box to the back, and then she came back out to the cafe floor and stood in the middle of it one last time. The fog was still on the lake. It would be there tomorrow and the day after. It would be there when someone else leased this space and put their own mark on it, their own floors and their own machine and their own regulars who came in from the cold and stayed for the warmth. It would be on the lake when she and Elliot were somewhere else building the 3rd version of their life, which would be different from the first 2 versions in ways she couldn't fully predict yet and was no longer afraid to find out. She picked up the last box. She carried it to the Land Cruiser, where Elliot was already in the passenger seat with his bag in the back, watching her come across the gravel path with the same measuring look he'd had since he was old enough to have a look. She put the box in and got in the driver's side and started the engine. "Ready?" she said. He looked at the cafe one more time, at the windows they'd cleaned together on Sunday mornings, at the sign above the door that she'd painted herself, and that was slightly uneven on the left side because she'd been painting signs for the first time and had been too stubborn to redo it. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." She pulled out of the lot and onto the road and drove north without looking in the rearview mirror, because looking back was the thing that broke people, and she had decided she was done being broken. Grasmere was 40 minutes north. The guest house was called the Fell House, and it had a garden that faced west and a kitchen with a decent window and a landlord who, when she called ahead, asked no questions she didn't want to answer. She'd been told about it by a woman who'd come into the cafe once, 18 months ago, passing through, who'd said it was the kind of place where people went when they needed to think. Mara had filed it away without knowing why. She always filed things away without knowing why. She always found out eventually. The road north was clear and the fog was lifting off the lake as the morning came properly, the way it always lifted, reluctantly, from the edges first, the water below appearing in pieces as though it was being discovered rather than revealed. She had watched it lift from behind her counter 400 times, and she had never grown tired of the mechanics of it, the specific slow way the light reclaimed the surface. And she watched it now through the windshield as she drove, and she let herself watch it without grief. Elliot reached over and turned the heater up without asking. His hand went back to his lap and he looked out the passenger window at the fields. After a while he said, "Do you think he'll actually come?" She thought about a man in a dark coat sitting in a corner table watching her son with an expression that had no management over it. She thought about exact change on the table for coffee he hadn't ordered yet. She thought about him standing in her kitchen with his hands flat on the table, anchoring, and she thought about him standing in a warehouse saying, "He's mine," raw and without cover, and meaning it in a way that cost him more than anything else in the room. "Yes," she said, "I think he'll come." Elliot nodded once. He didn't say anything else. He went back to watching the fields, and she went back to watching the road, and the two of them drove north through the lifting fog toward a place they hadn't been yet. And the morning came up around them clean and cold and entirely without promises, which was the only kind of morning Mara had ever really trusted. 3 days later, just before noon, someone knocked on the door of the guest house. She was in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, and Elliot was at the table with his homework. And when the knock came, they both looked up and looked at each other. Elliot looked at her. She set down her cup. She walked to the door and put her hand on it and stood there for a moment, not hesitating, not afraid, just taking one breath, the deliberate kind, the kind that means, "I am here. I am awake. I know what I am doing." Then she opened it. Adrian Vale stood on the step in a coat that was less well-made than the one she'd first seen him in, and his face had the particular quality of a man who has done difficult things and is not yet entirely sure who he is on the other side of them. His hands were at his sides. He had not tried to let himself in. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You knocked," she said. "You told me to." "I did." A beat. The garden behind him was full of November light, pale and clean, and a bird was doing something in the hedge, and Grasmere was very quiet in the way that only small places are quiet, not empty, but settled, the particular piece of somewhere that has been inhabited for a long time by people who chose to stay. "Are you going to open it further?" he said. She considered him. The man who had sat in her corner table for 3 weeks. The man who had built an empire and lost it in a warehouse in Keswick. The man who did not know yet how to be a father and might learn badly and would certainly make mistakes and was standing on her step in a less expensive coat with his hands at his sides, waiting. She pulled the door open. "Come in," she said. "Elliot's doing homework and I just made coffee." He came in. She closed the door behind him. From the kitchen, Elliot's voice. "There's an extra chair." Adrian stopped in the hallway. He looked toward the kitchen doorway. He looked at the back of a 9-year-old boy sitting at a table with his homework, who had said there's an extra chair in the tone of someone making a simple factual statement that was also, underneath its plainness, an invitation. Something moved across Adrian's face that she didn't look away from this time. The stripped thing, the mask-off thing, but different now. Not the raw grief of a man who has lost something, but the raw uncertainty of a man who has been handed something he doesn't yet know how to hold without breaking it. She put her hand on his arm, just briefly, just enough. "He doesn't need you to be anything you're not," she said quietly. "He just needs you to show up. That's the whole job." He looked at her. "That's the whole job," she said again. He nodded. One breath. Then he walked toward the kitchen. She stood in the hallway of the guest house in Grasmere and listened to the sound of a chair being pulled out, and a boy saying something she couldn't quite hear, and a man answering in the careful voice of someone learning a new language one word at a time. And the November light came through the hall window pale and even, and the bird in the hedge did whatever birds do on ordinary mornings. And the fog that had been on the lake in Harwick was somewhere behind them now, and Mara Whitmore stood very still in the middle of it, and felt the particular fierce quiet of a woman who has survived everything she was handed and is, for the first time in longer than she can name, not bracing for what comes next. She went to the kitchen. She poured a third cup of coffee. She sat down at the table, and the morning, slowly, continued.